Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are tackling something that, honestly, is pretty stressful, but really, really important for anyone with a cat. Emergency first aid for deep wounds. Specifically, we're going to focus on how to manage serious bleeding.
Yeah, this is all about what you can do right away in those critical first moments. Because when you're facing that kind of trauma with your pet, everything we looked at points to two main goals, right?
Yeah.
Stop the bleeding and prevent infection. Get those handled quickly, and it makes a huge difference for the vet visit later.
Absolutely. That's the core mission. But, before we even get near the wound itself, the sources really highlight something crucial, something maybe we don't think about first.
Which is?
Restraint. Wounds hurt. A lot. So the very first step before anything else has to be figuring out how to safely restrain your cat.
It's so true, and probably the hardest part. You've got an animal that's scared, in pain, probably trying to bolt. If you can't keep them relatively still, you're not going to be able to apply steady pressure or treatment.
Especially not for that crucial 5 or 10 minutes we'll talk about. Okay, so restraint first. Got it. Now let's get into the treatment itself. First step seems to be figuring out what kind of bleeding we're dealing with. And this brings up a potential pitfall, something many of us might reach for instinctively. Imagine you've got your first aid kit. What's that one really common item, often used for cleaning wounds, that could actually make bleeding worse in this situation? We'll come back to that specific item. But first, identifying the blood flow.
Yes, exactly. Because knowing the source tells you how urgently you need to act. You're looking for two main types, arterial and venous.
Okay, arterial and venous. In the heat of the moment, how do you tell the difference? What are the visual cues?
Arterial is the one that really gets your heart pounding. The blood is bright red, almost vibrant sometimes, and because it's coming directly from an artery under pressure from the heart, it will often spurt rhythmically.
Spurting, okay. That sounds bad.
It is bad. It signals a really critical situation. Venous blood, on the other hand, is usually a darker red. It doesn't spurt. It tends to just ooze or flow more steadily. Sometimes you might have a mix, of course, but seeing that bright red spurting is your signal for immediate, serious action.
Got it. Bright red, spurting is arterial top priority. Darker red, oozing is venous. So once we know that, or even if we're not sure, there are a couple of big don'ts people often make, right?
Definitely. Big mistakes that seem intuitive but really aren't helpful.
The first one involves wounds that have actually stopped bleeding on their own. What's the rule there?
Simple. Leave alone. If the bleeding has stopped, the body has formed a clot. That's nature's bandage. If you start wiping at it, trying to clean it too early, you'll probably dislodge that clot.
And then the bleeding just starts all over again?
Exactly. You undo the body's work and put the cat back in crisis mode. Don't wipe a clot.
Okay, don't disturb a clot. And that brings us back to my earlier question, that common first aid item.
Ah, yes. Hydrogen peroxide.
The fizzy stuff.
The fizzy stuff. And this is a big one. Decades of, habit tell us peroxide cleans wounds. But the sources are really clear. Do not pour hydrogen peroxide on a fresh bleeding wound.
Why not? What does it actually do?
Well, the fizzing action, it actively dissolves blood clots. So if you pour it on, you're chemically breaking down the very thing that's trying to stop the bleeding. You're essentially forcing the bleeding to restart or continue, working against the body's natural process.
Wow. Okay, so it actually undoes the clotting, and I think the research also mentioned it can damage healthy tissue.
I can, yeah.
Okay.
It's quite harsh on the cells around the wound, which can actually slow down the healing process later. So for emergency bleeding control, skip the peroxide. Your goal is stopping the flow, not that kind of chemical reaction.
Right. So avoid wiping clots, avoid peroxide. What should we do? What's the go-to method?
Direct pressure. It's the safest and honestly the most effective way to control bleeding in almost all emergency situations. A pressure dressing.
Seems simple enough. Apply pressure. But you mentioned the details matter. How do we do it right?
Okay, so you need something absorbent. Sterile gauze squares from a first aid kit are ideal. Several of them. If you don't have gauze, grab the cleanest cloth you can find, a t-shirt, a towel folded into a thick pad. Needs to have some bulk. Place that pad directly onto the bleeding wound.
And then just hold it there. For how long? You mentioned a specific window.
Yes, and this is critical. You need to apply firm, constant pressure for sustained 5 to 10 minutes. Minimum. 5 to 10 minutes.
That sounds like an eternity when you're dealing with a panicked, hurting cat.
It feels like it. But that time is what the body needs for the initial soft clot to stabilize into a stronger, fibrin mesh. The biggest mistake people make is lifting the pad after a minute or two to check.
To peek? Yeah. I can see myself wanting to do that.
Everyone wants to. But if you peek, you break that fragile clot, the bleeding starts again, and you've just reset the clock. You must commit to that full 5, ideally 10 minutes without lifting the pressure.
This really drives home why that initial restraint is so important. You need both hands free, potentially, just focused on that pressure.
Absolutely. Once you've hit that time mark, hopefully the bleeding has slowed or stopped. Now you need to secure it. If you have bandages, leave the original gauze pad right where it is. Yeah. Don't remove it, even if it's soaked. Just put a snug bandage right over it. If you don't have bandaging stuff, well, you just keep holding that pressure manually until you get to the vet.
Okay, so if we do bandage it, there's a really important safety check we need to keep in mind, right? About circulation.
Yes, vital. You've put on a snug bandage, maybe even tight, to control bleeding, but you have to watch the limb below the bandage. the paw, the toes. Look for swelling. If the paw starts to puff up quickly below the bandage, that's a bad sign.
Meaning the bandage is too tight, cutting off blood flow.
Exactly. It's impairing circulation. That needs to be fixed immediately.
How do you take it all off?
Yeah.
But what about the bleeding?
You have to loosen or remove that tight outer bandage right away. Don't hesitate. Then reassess. Often the best thing is to add more padding, more gauze, more cloth directly over the wound itself. Then apply a second bandage over that increased bulk, maybe a little less tightly than the first time. This helps concentrate the pressure where it's needed on the bleed without strangling the whole limb. Then get straight to the vet.
Okay, pressure dressing is plan A, the gold standard. But what if? What if it's just not working? That really heavy arterial spurting, for example.
Right. Sometimes direct pressure just isn't enough for severe arterial bleeds. That's when you have to consider the absolute last resort measure, a tourniquet.
Last resort? That sounds serious.
It is. Let's be crystal clear. You should never use a tourniquet if direct pressure is controlling the bleeding, even if it's slow going. Tourniquets are only for life-threatening, uncontrollable arterial bleeding on a limb or the tail. That's it.
Okay, only for unstoppable spurting on an arm, leg, or tail. If we absolutely have to use one, where does it go?
Always above the wound, between the wound and the heart. You're trying to cut off the arterial supply before it reaches the hole. You can use a strip of cloth, a belt, even a piece of gauze folded lengthwise, something strong.
And how tight? How do you apply it properly?
You loop it around the limb, above the wound. Tighten it by hand first. If that's not enough, you can slip a stick, a pen, something rigid under the loop and twist it. Keep twisting only until the bright red spurting stops. No tighter than necessary. The moment that heavy flow stops, that's enough.
Okay, twist until the spurting stops. Now, there's a really crucial rule with tourniquets, probably the most important thing to remember after deciding to use one. The time limit.
The 10-minute rule. Absolutely non-negotiable. You must loosen the tourniquet every 10 minutes.
Every 10 minutes. Why? What happens if you don't?
Tissue death. It's called tissue hypoxia, lack of oxygen. If you leave a limb completely cut off from blood supply for too long, say during a long drive to the vet, the tissues downstream from the tourniquet will die from lack of oxygen. It's irreversible.
You could lose the limb.
You can absolutely guarantee the loss of the limb. That 10-minute clock is ticking the moment you tighten it.
So, at the 10-minute mark, you loosen the tourniquet. What happens then? What are you looking for?
You loosen it carefully and watch the wound. Two possibilities. One, the bleeding has stopped or slowed dramatically to an ooze. Great news. In that case, remove the tourniquet completely and immediately apply a snug pressure bandage like we discussed before.
Okay, that's the good outcome. What if the serious bleeding starts right back up when you loosen it?
If the arterial bleeding continues, you have to let it bleed for about 30 seconds.
Let it bleed? Why?
To allow a quick flush of oxygenated blood back into those tissues downstream. Just for about 30 seconds. It helps keep them viable. After that 30-second flow, you immediately retighten the tourniquet for another 10-minute cycle.
So it's tighten for 10 minutes, loosen, check. If still bleeding hard, let it flow for 30 seconds, then tighten again for another 10, and you just keep repeating that cycle.
You repeat that cycle. Tighten 10, loosen 30 seconds, retighten 10, all the way to the veterinary hospital until they can take over. It's demanding, but it's the only safe way to use a tourniquet long term.
Wow. Okay, so let's pull this all together. What are the absolute key takeaways from this deep dive?
I think it boils down to a few critical things. First, know the difference visually between that spurting arterial blood and the oozing venous kind. It tells you the urgency. Second, forget the hydrogen peroxide for bleeding wounds. It works against clotting. Big no-no. Third, direct, sustained pressure, that full 5 to 10 minutes without peaking, is your #1 tool. Master that technique.
And fourth, tourniquets are an extreme last resort for limbs and tails only, and that 10-minute on, 30-second off cycle is absolutely vital to prevent tissue death. Understanding these specific stats, these numbers, it really does cut through the panic and helps avoid those common dangerous mistakes.
Exactly. It gives you a plan. But remember what we started with. Restraint. Holding firm pressure for 5 or 10 minutes or managing a tourniquet cycle requires having control of a potentially frantic, hurting animal. So, if all this relies on being able to handle your cat under extreme duress,
Then the final thought really has to be about preparation, doesn't it? What steps do you need to take now before an emergency ever happens? Things like desensitization training, maybe. Regular handling drills. How can you prepare your cat and yourself so they might tolerate that necessary restraint when they're stressed and in pain?
that's the challenge to think about long before you ever need that first aid kit. Proactive preparation.
Something definitely worth considering. This has been incredibly important information, a vital deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.